Today we are looking at a Roland JX-8P 6-voice synthesizer released in 1985. Next thing we're going to do is take the synth apart or get it open so we can take a look at some of the issues we're having inside with the patchy keys that not working and also the output on the back being spontaneous. We'll get an overall look at how it looks inside, see if anybody's been in here before. It's not plugged into mains anytime I'm opening it up, especially for the first time. And if you're just getting into this, I highly recommend you never plug the synthesizer in while it is open. If you get into advanced troubleshooting later down the line, it's a requirement, but certainly if you're just starting out, you're going to want to make sure that there's nothing plugged in. It's also best practice to either let the synth sit for a while or discharge the capacitors on the power supply if you're going to be working on it, because they do and can hold a charge for a significant amount of time. So to start, we're going to take the screws out, and it's been a little while since I've opened up a JX-8P, but we're going to start by taking off the 3 on the side here and also on this side over here, and then I believe there are also some screws on the bottom that we are going to have to remove in order to open this, and there's a hinge on the back. It will open like a clamshell. So I'm just going to start by coming in here. Screw as far out as possible, and when I remove these, to make sure that they go back in the right location, what I like to do is set them in the same order and the outline of the synthesizer. So since this came out of the front left part of the synthesizer, I'm going to put it in the front left and then position the additional screws as I remove them accordingly. You can see the whole synth is right here on this board. There are some additional boards behind it, this main board, but these are just display and panel button boards. They're not doing any of the actual synthesizing of the audio, but you can see this is our control section and memory section over here. You've got our EEPROMs, which store patch data and operating system data. It looks like a factory Roland battery over here, but obviously it's still holding patches because we saw that there were still patches and not just jarbled info on the screen when we were testing it. CPU, and again, memory sections, but you can see the voices right here. A, B, C, D, E, and F. This is a 6-voice synthesizer, and so you can see that each one of these is the circuit path that handles your oscillators, your filter, amplifiers, envelopes, that sort of thing. And then we've got our jacks down here, and we definitely felt like we had some issues with the jacks, so we're gonna have to take a look at those. And everything here looks original. These capacitors are factory original from Roland, so you've got your mains voltage that comes in over here, and our transformer gets rectified, and then it goes through your filter capacitors and your voltage regulators, and then from there power gets sent out to the rest of the synthesizer from right here. And our key bed connections come from right here. You can see there are 3 of them in this case. Got some chassis ground over here. This does feel pretty loose, and you can see we've got a lot of muck. So first thing I do in this case is take a little hand vacuum and go over and clean up all this dusty area. In order to gain access to be able to take a closer look at these jacks and the solder connections here to see what's causing our intermittent audio, we're going to need to remove this board because it's all connected. But you can't just go in and take these screws out and start pulling on it, because there are screws that hold these MIDI jacks to the rear panel here. So you want to start by closing the clamshell, Make sure there's nothing in the way. Again, that your synthesizer is unplugged and turned off. Most of the time Roland was nice and they didn't use a lot of the same size connectors in the same locations, but it's always smart to make marks like you see here as you remove them, because then when you go back you can see if those marks match up, even if there is a question and you have two connectors with the same amount of pins on them. So always a smart thing to do. Sometimes you may have to cut some of the zip tie cables you see here in order to remove a board like this, so we're going to have to do that as well, but I'll continue removing them. You simply grab from the wiring, try to get as much grip on the whole thing as possible, and then you pull straight out. Again, these all have little marks on them so we can be sure when we come back and put it back together that they'll go into the right locations. And now we should have much better access to the rest of the board, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the rest of these screws. Okay, so now I'm going to remove this board. I've removed all the screws from each area. I have myself grounded. It's always best to be safe. You don't want to have any static electricity built up when you're handling these boards. These later 80s boards, less of a concern than 70s boards, but again, it's best to play it safe. And as you pull it out, if you've removed the screws from the back, it should just come right out. This ribbon cable, just move it off to the side. Be careful not to hit anything. And here we go. JX-8P main board. So one of the things you'll notice is that there'll be a lot of old yellow flux residue on the bottom of these boards from when they were heat flow soldered at the factory, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I typically, if it's as nasty as this one is, like to clean it up, and I'll just use these foam swabs. I prefer not to use Q-tips. A lot of people do. You can, but the fibers from the Q-tips get everywhere, whereas with these you don't have that problem. It's just good practice. I like having things clean, and you can just pat these onto a paper towel, which will absorb most of that old flux, and then I'll come get it wet again and come back in and do more cleaning, and you'll notice again how quickly it will start to pick up this really nasty orange flux. And you will have to replace these every once in a while. They're just going to get torn up and just ultimately get too gross to continue to use. But I'll just go around the edge of the board and get most of the main gun. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean, but just to remove some of this ancient flux. After doing a full spray down with some rubbing alcohol, 99%, you can see how much cleaner it looks, how much neater it looks, how much easier it is to see if there's a cold or a bad solder joint somewhere. It certainly makes it easier to service when it's in this sort of shape. Okay, so while we have the board out here, it just makes sense, even though we know that the patches were fine and it was storing memory fine, to check and see what our battery is looking like as far as remaining voltage. And this looks like the original battery to me. It could have been replaced with something that looks the same, but let's see if it's holding a strong charge or if it's close to needing replacement. So I'm going to turn my voltmeter on here, and I know that this is the positive side of the battery, and that the negative side will be connected to ground. So I'm just going to use this ground over here and touch the top of the battery, and you can see over here that it's reading 3.175 volts, which is exactly where we want it. A good battery should be reading over 3 volts, and that's right within spec. So no need to change this at this time. As you can see on this switch is looking pretty gross. There's a lot of gunk built up down there, and we were having intermittent issues with the audio jacks, so we're going to want to check this switch and get it nice and cleaned out, as well as check these solder joints underneath our outputs here, because if we have any cold joints down here, that could also be a reason why we're getting intermittent outputs. And if we do have cold joints, it's a very easy fix. And if this is just a dirty and oxidized switch, then we've got an easy fix as well. It could be to the point to where it needs to be replaced, but might as well try cleaning it first. One of the best tools for any beginner who wants to solve minor issues when it comes to fixing a vintage synthesizer, Deoxit is your best friend. Any contact cleaner really, but even though this stuff is expensive, it works incredibly well. It comes in a few different versions. This is the version to get if you're just going to get one, the Deoxit D5. It also comes in what's called fader lube, or F5, and that's great for use in sliders, but you always start with this because this is the contact cleaner, and it'll help remove oxidation. And we're going to clean these two switches here, and you can see that there are little holes on top of each switch, and we're going to shoot some of this contact cleaner in there. You don't need to drench it, but then we're going to work the switches as much as we possibly can. So I'm going to shake the can, line it up, just some quick bursts in each of these. And then I'm going to start working them. I just want to work it over and over and over again. Get them as clean as you possibly can. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the key bed so that we can take a look at the contacts underneath and see why we might be having a few keys that are a little bit touch and go as far as making connection. So in this particular key bed, the screws in the rear you have to access from the inside. On a lot of synths, for like the Junos, you access all of them from underneath. But in this one, the 3 rear screws are accessed from the inside, from the top. And notice this one is attached to a ground. Make sure you keep your screws together. Now it's loose. One thing we're going to need to do though is clip another one of these zip ties, because these are our connections for the key bed, and this is our Aftertouch connection right over here. So we need to be careful when we flip it. Now you can see This is a semi-weighted key bed. You can see all the weights that are glued inside the keys there. And this is a mechanical key bed versus ones that use the rubber pads, which is very common in other synths like the Juno 106 and the Korg Poly 61. But instead on this, the mechanical key beds usually feel a little bit nicer. And you can see as you push a key, it forces this copper strip down, which makes contact with this other copper strip. And then you have an additional circuit here that is how it registers Aftertouch. As you push the key down, it registers the trigger here, and as you push harder, there is a little pad here that runs the entire length that lets the board know when you're using Aftertouch. But that gets oxidized over time and needs to be cleaned. So again, I'm just taking a little bit of rubbing alcohol on a foam swab, and most of these keys were working fine. It was literally just a few of them that were touch and go. I would imagine if this key bed was played more often that ultimately they could end up cleaning themselves, but I'm just doing a gentle rub down in between the contacts. You want to be careful if you do this. You do not want to bend them back in any way that's too far, because ultimately then they could end up not making contact even when the key is pressed. So again, I'm just doing a little light dusting, because when we flipped this over there was a lot of cobwebs and dust bunnies in here, and that certainly could be getting in between our contacts and causing us some issues. If I pull this back, you can see underneath that there's a little raised portion of the copper, and that's what makes contact. So I'm just again gently rubbing the underside and the raised portion to get any debris out of there, and I think we'll have this key bed working again to its full potential. Okay, so in order to gain access to the Aftertouch strip, I need to remove these keys. And this style of key is very common in the Roland world, where there's either a horizontal spring like this or a vertically mounted spring that you have to remove for each key prior to being able to remove the key. And what you also need to be aware of is sometimes different springs are used for white keys instead of black keys. So when you take your first two off, you need to make sure you look at the length and diameter to make sure that they are in fact the same, or if they are different, that you separate them depending on the corresponding key. As far as tools, this is just a standard $8 set of dental tools from Amazon. If you plan on doing this more than once, I'd recommend investing that money because it makes them a lot easier to remove. And you simply take a hooked end of a dental tool like this, place your thumb over or finger over the spring here so it can't fly off, and you simply remove it off the back. Oopsie. And there's your spring. So I'll take that one off, and now we're going to take a look at a black one. When we remove them, this is the black, came off the black one, this came off the white. And these are in fact different screws, different springs. Sometimes they'll be different colors, but in this case they are not. Next step in removing the keys, after you've removed the spring, and double check to make sure that on these Roland key beds that you've removed the plastic strip that goes along in front of the keys. It locks them in. On this particular JX-8P, it was already removed, and whoever was in here before did not replace it. Which unfortunately you see a little too often, but there's not very much risk of the keys coming out as long as the spring is properly installed. In order to remove the key, you simply pull on the front, slide it forward, and it will come out. See, this little hook part goes underneath here. You can see already that we have absolutely no grease left on our bushings there. And in almost every key bed, white keys have to be removed first before you can remove the black keys, and after you've removed them all, black keys have to be put back in first before you put the white keys back in. Otherwise, you'll end up not being able to get them back in and having to remove them all again. So once again, you simply pull forward and remove the keys. This will give us access to the key bed. Here is our chassis, our key bed chassis after removing all the keys, white and black. And I think you can see a number of things jump out right away. It's pretty filthy. There are rust spots, especially towards the middle of the key bed. And you'll notice these lines, which is actually the lines in between the keys where dust settles over time. And the rust usually lines up and a lot of times with those lines, because dust will fall, land in a particular area in a line, and then if there's a lot of moisture in the air, the dust in those particular lines absorbs that moisture, and then it just sits there and causes the chassis to start to rust. You can also see that all of our bushings are dry. At least we still have most of them. These are what help the action and the feel of the key bed. And so this is the Aftertouch Strip here. You can see it's in fairly rough shape. Some of our key bed bushings are also coming off, and you can see they've broken. This happens when they get dry and just get worn out. The Aftertouch Strip likely has a lot of oxidation where the contact meets the copper, and as a result it's not making a good connection, and no matter how hard you press, you're not getting any voltage sent back to tell the processor that Aftertouch is in fact being utilized. So we're going to remove the Aftertouch strip and see if we can refurbish it. So I've peeled the Aftertouch strip back from the base here. This is the top portion. It's been flipped over with these striped rubber pieces sandwiched in between. So top, middle, bottom. And if you look closely along the metal strip here and here, that there is oxidation on both sides. You can see kind of cloudy areas, and this is what we're going to clean off with, once again, some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. We need to treat this rust. Certainly the bad areas. It would probably be fine to put it back together as is, but if you're in here, you might as well try and go at it. I use this Rust-Oleum product. You don't have to leave it on super long. Spread it around and it will dissolve the rust fairly well, so it comes out in kind of a goop. So I'll just shoot it in a few of the worst areas and then come back in with a foam swab again to spread it around. I want to be careful not to get any of it on the Aftertouch strip, just so as to not cause any issues with that. I'm going to go back and use my dirty swabs that I was using to clean the Aftertouch strip because they still have some life in them. and they're fairly expensive, so use them to the best of your ability. Okay, so after we did our rust treatment on our key bed chassis here, you can see how much nicer it's looking. It's actually clean, and most of the rust has been, if not all of it, has been eaten through. And then we took a scrub brush and totally cleaned off all the remaining residue and rinsed it off. It's looking a lot better now, so we shouldn't have any rust issues with this key bed chassis for a long time. The next thing we need to do before we replace the keys is to address these bushings down here, and you can see we're missing some of them. I've got some replacements here, but some of them are off in their position and none of them are lubricated, and all these should have some lubrication on them, so that when your keys, what these bushings do is they keep them traveling vertically, because as you put a key on, it slides up into this location here, and as you go up and down on that key, these bushings here keep your key centered as you move up and down and press the key. So first thing we need to do is take a look at bushings like this, which are still intact but are off and out of position, and we need to slide them back into their appropriate location. You just want to try to make the end of the bushing match up with the end of the metal portion, if not the bushing sticking out just a little further than the metal portion, because again, it's acting as a guide. It's keeping your keys from clacking to some extent, a little bit less so on this key bed chassis, but we're going to move all these into position, and we're going to take replacements we got from Synthar and put them on the ones that have completely broken off, because over time, especially at the ends here where they wrap around, they'll get dry if they have not been re-lubricated and the synthesizer hasn't been serviced in a long time, and they'll just break at the seams there. So we'll get all these positioned properly and replace the ones that had broken off, and then we're going to lubricate them with some white lithium grease. So we're using white lithium grease. This is a bit of a controversial topic because some people prefer to use other lubricants. I like the white lithium grease, but there are other options out there. But this works well in my opinion, and what we're going to do is we're just going to cover the entire bushing as best we can to enable us to lubricate the keys. So usually how I do this is I get a big glob on the end of my foam swab and I just kind of dab it all the way down, at least as far as I can go without running out of white lithium grease. And then we'll come back. I'm going to add some more here. And I'm just going to make sure that these are thoroughly coated on all sides, top, bottom, front. It's going to take me a few minutes to do that, but I think you get the picture.